Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our meeting, or I should say our webinar on building credit risk scorecards to meet regulatory requirements. I am Krishna Mehta, and I am one of the principals at Jigyasa Analytics. A little bit about us. Jigyasa is an analytics consulting firm, and we are based out of New Jersey. And we develop analytics solutions using predictive analytics and machine learning and help organizations come up with more efficient solutions for their marketing operations and credit risk programs. So a little bit about what we will talk about today. Today, we will talk about bias prevention. We'll talk about transparency. We'll talk about methodology, and we'll talk about documentation. These are some key things we feel are important when you are building a scorecard for which will be reviewed by regulators. So these are kind of some of the big themes and areas which they like to focus on. They always look for these issues. And so we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these issues. We also have a general webinar on the best practices for credit risk modeling, which covers the general process, and that we schedule regularly, and our 2024 schedule will come out in a few weeks, and that will have this webinar there as well. So on to our discussion on bias prevention. Okay. So why worry about bias? That's the first question. So bias in the selection of the sample will weaken the scorecard, and it becomes less robust to changes in credit policy, marketplace, or the economy. Any changes there, if your sample is not representative, there are biases in its selection, that will impact that it will impact how robust the model and the scorecard are to these shocks. And then so to correct for that and to ensure that, we need to select a sample which is represented over a long enough time window, so that it sees the different aspects of variations in the market, the economy, all of that. And it represents different market segments. So it should have a cross-section, representative cross-section for the organization. And it should represent the different products, the different deal types, all adequately in that sample. And so that is kind of it's kind of common sense, but it is good practice. And a lot of times omissions are made on basis of convenience or to speed up things, and biases creep into the sample. And regulators will look at this pretty closely and make sure there are not biases there. And then while we are talking about biases, I want to focus on one bias, which is excluding non-funded. And that is one of the biggest problems. Look, the non-funded, when you are applying your scorecard, you're applying it to everyone, whoever comes through the door. But if you are building your scorecard just on your funded population, the scorecard has not really seen any of the non-funded. And so what it will predict there is a wild card. And that is why it is very important to build a robust model and the ensuing scorecard, which includes the non-funded population. And the regulators will insist on this significantly. So, and that brings us to the whole area of reject inferencing. So how do you go about this process of reject inferencing? So you can start, there are two major approaches I will talk about. The first is bureau augmentation. So what is done here is that we take the accounts which are not booked, and we go to the bureau and tell them that, okay, give us performance for these accounts over this observation period. It could be 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, depending on the product for which you are building the scorecard. It's very unusual for it to be more than 3 years, though I'm not saying it's improbable, but it's more likely to be something like 2 or 3 years. Uh, mm, and then you define an augmented bad field, where for those who you've got bureau performance but were not booked with you, you use the bureau field. And for those who had um, funded with you, you use the continue to use the observation you have on them. So the models are built using both the booked and the augmented population. So this is one approach to including the non-funded in your sample. And I will talk about another approach, which is called data parceling. And again, these are not the only two approaches, but I've kind of chosen to give you two which are the most widely used and have greatest, and you'll have the greatest success with them as well. So the way data parceling works is this helps organizations where they might not have good fields on the bureau, their business is unique, or if, for example, it's an expensive proposition to get bureau data, and to get it for additional, just non-funded, is not a financially viable option. So in these situations, you develop models on funded. That's the first step. Then you score the non-funded population with that model. So you get score for every non-funded. And then using the score, you probabilistically assign bad to the non-funded population. So each score range has a certain bad rate from the funded population. And using that, you assign probabilistically, you assign bads for different score ranges in the non-funded population. And then there you might say that, okay, this model was built on our funded population, and in general we know we expect the non-funded to be 2 times worse or 3 times worse. And there are empirical ways to determine how many times worse they're likely to be. It's still a guesstimate, but you can make a more educated guesstimate. And so you might apply an multiplier to this bad you've got from the model score. And that is how you get bad for both the funded and the non-funded, and you include both in your model development sample. The advantage of doing this is, first of all, you've got a bigger sample. You are building a model which will be more robust. You are eliminating bias, which is very important to the regulators, because now you can truly say that the model was built on the kind of population we will see through the door. And and be more robust to changes, because it's seeing a more variety of applicants. It's likely to be more robust to changes. So this model will be more robust to market economic shocks. Also, you want to change your credit policy a little bit and go down a little bit, and take you have a basis for doing this based on the model. And another thing which is not regulatory driven, but is all the same, almost always our clients find a swap-in population, a group which they would have rejected otherwise, but because they are using the model, come in as a pretty good population. And so that's an additional advantage of taking this approach. But on the whole, these things are needed to ensure that your model is not biased, your scorecard is not biased. Okay, so next we move on to transparency, the other theme I wanted to talk about. So why require transparency? First of all, there are the fair lending requirements. Generally, that they cannot be ignored. But beyond that, even in, say, the equipment finance, business to business lending, uh, ensuring transparency allows you to understand the limitations and the risks of the model. And think of the big financial crisis we had in around 2008. One of the critiques, all the models failed to predict that. And one of the reasons was, among the other things, of the bias and all that had crept into the different models. Another thing which is commonly acknowledged is that these models were had become very complex, non-transparent, and while they were giving short-term returns and everyone were going after them, very few people in the organization had true understanding of what the models were designed to do or what they were doing, a good understanding of the inputs, all of that, and the consequent limitations. And that is where and that is why they did not know how to use the models. If you don't understand the key components of the model or what is a valid way of using it, you are going to lose that model. So that and you are going to misuse that model and get bad results. So a related point then comes up that, okay, so which I want to address here, because it's kind of everyone is talking about machine learning. And so how do we ensure transparency in a machine learning environment? So okay, so in general, there is resistance to using machine learning models directly due to transparency and fairness concerns. But what we have seen is, if you apply them, there are 15 to 25% improvement in model performance. So then, is there a way we can use it and then still be okay with the regulators? And the answer is yes, there are. And I will list that out, how we can use machine learning. So there are three common approaches to applying machine learning to credit risk modeling. The first is the machine learning algorithm is used directly. So that's one approach. And some of the very large banks I know, playing around with this, trying to expand the use of machine learning algorithms directly in this process. There is indirect application, and I'll talk about what I mean there. And then there is the intermediate application, where, and I will again talk about all three. The intermediate application, every organization can do. The indirect application needs a little bit more sophistication, and direct approach needs a lot more hand-holding and greater caution. So it's best done at this point by very large organizations or people who have a pretty good data science team or supporting consulting around it. So direct application machine learning algorithm is directly used. In this case, you have to restrict input predictors and model complexity. You have to put some filters up front so that the machine learning algorithm does not become too opaque and complex. Then there are these fairness and transparency issues. So one way organizations are going about it is they're saying, hey, you are used to looking at these 10 fields and plots over 10 fields, these 10 fields and metrics, and looking at performance around these to judge whether the scorecard is transparent, fair, is so we build a machine learning algorithm driven scorecard, but then we give you relationship plots and metrics over these key fields used in credit decisioning. And using that, you still can, even though you do not see the inner workings of the model, you still can make an assessment whether this scorecard would treat the process fairly or not. So that is going to be a workaround which works, which addresses the actual concern around transparency, at least from a fair lending perspective, and also from a model performance perspective, because if you are looking at these metrics and you can make evaluation of how the model is doing. And then there are more interpretable algorithms, for example, XGBoost, which so all machine learning algorithms are not the same. Some are more opaque, others are more transparent, and that also can help you apply this directly. Moving on to the intermediate application of machine learnings. What is done here in this indirect application is machine learning model is developed and scorecard generated. Then a traditional model is built using machine learning model score as the dependent variable, and in variance of this, the machine learning model score is used as a weighting factor in the traditional model. And then the traditional model satisfies all the requirements of the regulators and the organization's own internal requirements, but it has piggybacked strongly on the machine learning model. So that's another approach. Okay, and then the intermediate approach, which I was talking about, which any organization can use, in building a scorecard and the underlying model, there are a lot of data science techniques you use, from data prep to exploratory analysis to stability. And there is nothing preventing you from using machine learning algorithms in each of these steps to identify the best interaction of the fields, gaining insight from unstructured data, detecting anomalies, and then stabilizing the model using bagging techniques. All of these are very much available to you, even if you are using a more traditional model for doing this exercise. Okay, so so after this, I want to talk. So that was on transparency. So I've covered bias, I've covered transparency. And then I want to talk a little bit about methodology, which is also very important in a regulatory environment. So, we'll start with data. So you need to ensure data quality in this. And and what you need to do for ensuring data quality is summary counts for each data source use, uh, data descriptions, summary statistics for all fields in each of the data source used. Then that is quality. Then there is also data stability. How stable is data over time? And generally, population stability index is created, and your scoring data needs to be monitored at least on a quarterly basis and compared to previous samples, including the development sample, to see if the data is stable, or are there things changing which might, it's like the canary in the coal mine. If the data is not stable, your model will start failing. So this is kind of an early detection. So okay, then about segmentation. And again, we will have a detailed webinar on segmentation techniques to be used with general model development exercises. And we are working on our schedule, and you should see something on our Eventbrite page in the next 2 weeks on that. But in general, you want to use approach that is supported by theory and industry practice. And if competing schemes are evaluated, for example, you tried some combination of um, data-driven versus business insight versus data availability segmentation, and if you've created competing schemes, then comparisons need to be made on accepted statistical metrics and the process documented very well. If there were 3 choices, you were considering 3 choices, why did you choose one? That needs to be explained in terms of statistical metrics, quantify the decision, and as well as document the process. Then on reject inferencing, I've already, talked a little bit, but over there too, you use approach supported by theory, provides sample details on reject inference. How many did you take? Why did you consider them? What were the metrics, population metrics there? And so provide all the model and statistical metrics you use for the selection of the augmented BAT field. And compare the final model performance for true and augmented BATs to make sure that model is doing good job in both places. And then the actual modeling and scorecard development, there are a lot of things you do. In general, use accepted theory for modeling and scorecard, check performance on validation and out of time samples, ensure your day fields are not correlated with each other and are within statistically accepted norms, measure performance based on accepted metrics like AUC, KS, lift. Missing imputation values used for each field included in the model should have a solid basis on theory or practice. Check for standard errors, p-values. Again, goes back to earlier point that the if fields included should be statistically robust. For scorecard calibration result for each model, there should be validation to make sure the model has not changed um, mm, in performance through the calibration process. And then finally, compare it with bureau scores to see that, first of all, your model is doing a better job, but also that there isn't anything weird in your model and that it is performing within accepted norms. So that was on methodology. And now if you've addressed bias, you've addressed transparency, you have addressed methodology, and you have done all the steps. Documentation at a lot of time at this point is just about collecting everything and making it available. But still there are some good practices around it, and I will just walk you through that. So a lot of decisions are made along the process, not just, okay, we will use this data, we'll use this window, we'll use this as a bad. A lot of that, not everything is empirically driven, a lot of it is business driven also. All the decisions around the whole process, and as you are building this whole credit risk scorecard, a lot of decisions will be made. All of this, you need to record the reasons behind them and document that. Then you're developing your sample and counts for each step along. You're doing so many steps with it at every stage, how your sample changed, how many fields got added, how many got dropped, how many records added, how many dropped, what was the distribution around them, what were some key metrics around that. Every step, all of that needs to be documented properly and made available. Then you need to provide technical details for theory behind methodology used at each step of the process. You might be using a certain way for imputing missing data, a certain way for reject inferencing, a certain technique for segmentation, a certain technique for model development. For each, you have to provide the technical theory behind that used in each step, along with academic or application references. So if you're basing it on some well-accepted white paper, you need to add that to your document. If it's based on a good textbook which recommends that, refer to the page number in the book and the reference textbook and give its reference. Provide summarized and detailed output reports for all steps listed in the regulatory process. So we've given you all the regulatory process, right? We talked about it, each step, you need this, so on. Provide the detailed outputs and also provide the summary output. And finally, provide a summary report on the performance and limitations of the model, including appropriate usage scenarios. All that should be well documented. So I've tried to give you an idea about how to go about the whole regulatory process when you are building a credit risk model. And it's just based on our experiences at Jigyasa at helping our clients do this. I hope this session was useful. I know some people who registered have not been able to attend, but I thank everyone who was able to make it today. And recording will be available and sent out for this to everyone who registered for this webinar. So, and please feel free to ask us if you have any questions or you would like us to elaborate on any points. And finally, we have a whole series of webinars coming up. Next week, we have the early warning system for fraud detection. That will be our last webinar in the financial services space for this year. But we will be updating our 2024 webinar schedule too pretty soon. So hope to see you again in another session. So thank you again, and have an excellent weekend.